Good morning again, everybody. I'm just waiting for my final instruction to be allowed to kick off, which I will do as soon as I'm given permission to do so. Great, that's just come through. So thank you, everyone, for logging in and registering. I know people are still coming into the room now, so I'll just speak a tiny bit to begin with, but I'm mainly going to go pretty fast. My name's Nick Hillman. I'm director of the Higher Education Policy Institute. We're the UK's only specialist higher education think tank. There's a little bit of background about myself on your screen that I hope you can see if you've made my slides nice and big. I used to work in Whitehall, Universities Minister. I'm a governor of two universities, two very different universities, a very large one and a really quite small one. And given all your expertise, I thought it might be relevant to note that I'm on the Remuneration Nominations Committees at Manchester, which by some definition is the biggest university in the country, not by every definition. As I say, those of you who don't know HEPI, we're the UK's only specialist higher education think tank. We only do higher education. We're supported by most universities up and down the UK and a small number of corporates. I've got lots of slides, so I'm going to spend sort of less than a minute on each one. So I apologise if it's a feat of concentration, but there's so much to say. I've been asked to talk about sort of government and policy and the wider environment. So let's kick off with, by the way, there's some of our recent publications free to see on our website. Let's and our recent blog, which I am going to kick off with because given all your levels of expertise, we do a daily blog and it goes out far and wide across the sector, and it is sometimes on the issues that are your bread and butter. And I wrote one just the other day looking at the impact of COVID on university pension provision, some of the very, very scary numbers coming out of USSHQ, and of course there are similar pension issues in the other pension schemes across the sector. But let's focus to the meat of what I want to talk about, which is government, higher education policy, the wider policy environment, and so on. We just lived through what I think is probably the busiest 5 years ever for higher education policy since higher education began in the UK about a millennium or so ago. And some of the reasons for that are up on the screen. There isn't sadly time to go through each of them, but you'll be familiar with lots of the huge regulatory changes, huge legal changes, impact of devolution, and so on and so forth. And that is even before you come on to Brexit and COVID, of course, which have led to more profound and more rapid change, particularly COVID and Brexit. Full effect is still to come, of course, than anyone could have imagined even a year ago when I spoke at this conference a year ago. I did go back to my slides from last year and I worked out that not that many of them would I be able to represent this year. Of course, disappointingly though, you might have expected when the date of this conference was set that I would talk lots about the spending review, because we were expecting a full multi-year spending review that was going to lay out what the different departments were going to have yesterday. What we got was a damp squib. We got a 1 year, pretty much a rollover. I'm told the word universities doesn't get mentioned once in the documentation that came out yesterday. A little bit on research funding, but there was next to nothing. So we're still waiting for the response to the Augur review. We're still waiting for the the official independent review of the teaching excellence framework. We're still waiting for the FE green white paper. We're still waiting for something that may or may not ever appear, which is a separate higher education strategy paper. So I'm going to say very little about yesterday because there's very little to say about yesterday. But the volume of change for our sector, despite yesterday's disappointment, is unlikely to change. I mean, we've had, you can see those 9 different government ministers since David Cameron's time in the university's job, not 9 different individuals, because some people have had the job more than once. But nonetheless, there's been huge churn at a ministerial level. And one of the problems when people say to me, predict what the government's going to do on higher education over the next few years, is it's not absolutely clear whether that churn has now stopped. We have Michelle Donnellan as the Universities Minister, Amanda Soloway as the Science and Research Minister, with Gavin Williamson sitting above them. And of course, the media, I make no personal judgment on this, HEPI's non-partisan and independent, but of course the media are now sniffing around and asking whether in the first reshuffle of 2021 Williamson will survive. If he doesn't, then there could be yet more churn. So the first challenge talking to you about higher education policy is everything's up in the air almost constantly these days relative to the more dim and distant past. The second challenge is we have a government which has been skeptical about expansion of higher education early on. This was after the current pandemic had started, but before the summer A-level row, Gavin Williamson poured cold water on Tony Blair's old target of getting half of all school leavers into higher education. I mean, it was a bizarre thing to do given that Tony Blair's target was for 2010 and we're now in 2020. But nonetheless, he was clearly trying to send a signal that he thought higher education expansion had gone too far, particularly in that traditional 3-year residential university model. Some very interesting books out about this at the moment, which take conflicting views. There's a book by David Goodhart that would very much be aligned with Gavin Williamson's view. He says too many people go to traditional degree courses. There's too few people go on vocational 2-year courses, maybe delivered by FE colleges, maybe delivered by newer universities in particular. I think it misunderstands the nature of our sector, but it's an important book and it's influential in Whitehall. There's another book, much more optimistic book by Peter Mandler, a historian at Cambridge, that says, look, as countries get richer, people just want more education. It's not just about will they become rich, they just want more education. Education is a consumer good, and as people have the ability to stay on longer, they want to stay on longer. I'm very much of the view that our sector needs to go on growing. Partly for OECD, but partly because when you look at the international data, and there's some on your screen, shows that the UK higher education sector has been growing, yes, but nothing like as fast as many of our main competitors in the developed world. Also, one of our most recent reports looked at future demand for higher education, which we've been doing ever since HEPI was founded 18 years ago. And this came out just a few weeks ago. And it reminded people that, we're on the cusp of a huge explosion in the number of 18-year-olds. If you've got kids at school, you'll know schools have been full to bursting in many parts of the country in recent times. And that number of, and what happened was the birth rate grew after the change of the century, just about 2002 or so, it grew, and so they are now 18, and they're about to start feeding through into the higher education system. So from next year, there's more school leavers than there were last year, and that's going to be true pretty much for the next 10 years or so. But actually, the biggest driver of demand for higher education is not the number of 18-year-olds, as many people think. It's the proportion of them who want to go on studying at university, which is, or in higher education, I should say, which is on the second chart here. And that's been growing for decades. And so, yes, it's true that it might level off at some point. Forget the zigzag in the middle, which is when the higher fees came in and people cancelled their gap years. But yes, it may tail off at some point. But if you speak to the international experts, they say it hasn't tailed off yet, even in countries that already send more people to higher education than we do. So there's our recent report, and it's worth, I think, looking at, because it puts raw numbers on how many extra places we're going to need over the next 15 years. The next issue I wanted to look at, and I've got 8 in total, is about admissions, university admissions, because of course one of the things the government has tried to provide clarity on only in the last few days is on university admissions. We had a very odd week the other week where on Monday UCAS said they wanted to rip up university admissions and have a different system. On Friday, Universities UK said the same, and on Saturday the government said the same in the form of Gavin Williamson. And I say it was odd for 2 reasons. One is that ripping up our university system, you have to be careful what you do with this. I'm a former secondary school teacher. I used to hate the weight put on my predicted grades for my sixth form students, year 13 students, when they came to university admissions. I didn't like it. Equally, ripping up our university system and moving to a system where nothing happens, or not very much happens, until students have their grades in their back pocket, has all sorts of challenges. So, for example, Mary Colonel Cook's quote in green there, she used to run UCAS. She said she's not convinced it's good for poorer students, where great inroads have been made in recent years. One reason for that is if the main activity on university admissions doesn't happen until after you've got your A-level results, who's going to be there to help you in the middle of summer to make sure you get the right place? Another problem is admission systems that don't really do very much until the A-level results are in people's hands put huge weight on people's exam results. But exams are not perfect. I know teacher assessments, as we found out this summer, aren't perfect either, but 1 in 4 exams would get a different grade if they were remarked by a senior examiner. So there are some real challenges. So the first point is there are some challenges. And the second point is I compared what the government and UUK and UCAS said to being like a polo mint. It was just a sort of, we want to change, but they hadn't there was a huge hole in the middle because they hadn't really actually decided which of the various alternative possible forms of university admissions they actually want. So there's still huge lack of clarity over that. And there's a bigger point here, helicoptering out to policy more generally, which is actually that discussion a couple of weeks ago showed something more profound about higher education policy, which is that there's a huge turf war going on at the moment in Whitehall, in various quangos, etc., for who actually controls university policy. You know, does UCAS control university admissions because they're the admissions body? Does Universities UK because they represent vice chancellors? Does the Department of Education because they're the government? Do individual universities because their autonomy on admissions is enshrined in primary legislation in the Higher Education and Research Act 2017? Or is it the Office for Students, the sector's main regulator, which were themselves meant to be reviewing admissions and started doing so in February, but have paused their review because of the pandemic? So actually, it's not just a discussion about who should go to university and how they get in. It's actually, there's a really important battle going on about where does university autonomy apply, where does it not apply, how much control does the government have over the university sector. The fourth point I wanted to come on to, and I will try to leave time for questions, and I see a few are coming in on the chat box, so do feel free to flag questions there, which I'll try to answer at the end of this session, which goes on till 10:45. The fourth of my challenges is around what's colloquially called dropout rates, but perhaps more accurately called non-continuation or non-retention rates. There are people who think they will explode this year because, as you can see in that Guardian story, because it's tough to be a student this year. There's some quite good polling evidence that suggests that just won't happen, that actually students they may not be having as good a time as normal at university, but you know, the alternatives to university are worse than normal too this year. So there's a very strong reason why they might want to stay and see their studies out, because it's delaying entry to the labour market. And it means that when they do enter the labour market, they'll be better skilled. But it's a really important issue, this dropout rate issue. I mean, the first is that we mustn't think of all students as the same. So this is from the HEPI Advance HE annual survey. I think Alison Johns is listening in today, the CEO of Advance HE, and it's a really important survey that we do with Alison and her colleagues every year, and we'll be doing it again next year, where we simply ask people, would you make the same choice again? About 2/3 of students say, yeah, same course, same university, no problem. If I was filling my UCAS form again. Quite a lot of people say, you know, about 1/3 say something else. But among specific demographics, the results are very different. So under half of Black students say they would choose the same course in the same university again. So there are some groups that are at much higher risk of dropping out than others. Commuter students, and there's actually a big overlap between BAME students and commuter students, are another group that are particularly at risk. And of course, there are things universities can do about this. I mean, what this data set shows is every bluey green line is a university, and every blue dot is what the regulators think should be that institution's dropout rate relative to other universities like them. And you can see that some universities have much lower dropout rate than is expected, and some have a much higher one than expected. So we do need to learn from good practice, and also learn negative lessons, I guess, from bad practice. And the reason I dwell on this in a speech about policy is not only is it topical because dropout rates could go up this year, but also because the government is determined through the Office for Students to start measuring the value of university courses using metrics. And the key two metrics they've alighted upon currently are non-continuation rates, low continuation rates, number one, and secondly, whether the graduates of that course are progressing onto what's called professional qualifications. So, as I know, you're all experts in HR issues, so that doesn't need explaining to you, but effectively to graduate level work. And they want to use those two things. And that's where the OFS just a week or so ago said that's where our regulatory attention needs to focus. Every time I read this, I end up thinking of the film Dead Poets Society, which, if you're anything like my age, you will remember very well. In Dead Poets Society, it starts, of course, with Robin Williams' character, an English teacher, telling his students to rip the pages out of their poetry textbook, because this poetry textbook says the only way you can judge the value of a poem is whether it's A, important, and B, how perfect it is. And then you can plot those two things on a simple graph, y-axis and an x-axis, and then work out how good a poem it is. And I worry we're doing something similar on higher education. We're saying the only way to judge a higher education course is by non-continuation rates and progression to graduate employment, and not by any of the other ways we can do it. Of course, higher education and education is transforming in all sorts of ways, not just those two. Sadly, that's all I've got time to say about that. But then I just want to talk on my my screen has slightly changed. So I hope you can still see my screens. If not, maybe some. There we are. Is about a report we recently did, given your expertise, on the gender pay gap. So there is a view out there that gender pay gaps have disappeared now. We're in a new world where women don't do worse than men in the labour market in terms of earnings. And there's a headline that suggests that that is true for younger women. Whether or not that is true, and the pandemic may of course be affecting it, it's certainly not true for graduates. And we wrote a whole report on this just the other week, trying to get under the skin of this, because it's really interesting. Far more women than men go to higher education. And we've written reports about how few men go to higher education and what should be done about that. But it's a matter of fact that far more women than men go to higher education. They're acting rationally, women, because non-graduate women are concentrated in low-paid sectors like retail, caring professions. So women are acting very rationally because higher education really pays off for women relative to non-graduate earnings. But of course, after university, there's still a big graduate gender pay gap, as you can see on the slide there. And women typically earn significantly less than men, even in the very early years of after graduation. So probably before they've become mothers, and if it's a traditional family setup, then maybe downgraded their hours or whatever. But it's there very, in the years immediately after graduation. So we wanted to get under the skin and look at why that is. And of course, universities are big employers as well as big producers of graduates. And it was some really interesting differences. Men, some of them play into the caricature of men and women, actually. So men, for example, are much more speculative in the jobs they apply for. They may not tick every attribute, but they think they have a punt anyway. Women are more likely, of course I'm talking on average, to look for things like job security, work-life balance, whether the job is for a meaningful cause or not. And one of our conclusions is that maybe sometimes men should act a bit more like women, think more about things like the work-life balance, and maybe sometimes women should think a bit more like men and apply for that job that is a bit more of a punt, but they might get it if they apply. And we also made some specific recommendations for things people could do. So we said universities should do things particularly through their career services to boost the confidence of female students, perhaps by telling them, about strategies that have worked for people in terms of applying for quite ambitious jobs, and maybe stress some of the non-pay aspects of having a fulfilling career to male students. We recommended that employers should avoid unconscious bias, a pretty unoriginal policy recommendation perhaps, but nonetheless an important one, and maybe do specific things that might boost women's position in the early years in the labour market through internships, for example. And we also said, this links a little bit to my last point, that government should, and media companies should stop measuring the quality of courses through comparative earnings, because if you have more female students than male students, but the labour market works against women in terms of earnings, then you're going to look like you're running less good courses, when it's not really a reflection of anything you're doing. It's a reflection of our wider society. My next point, I'm sorry to go so fast, but there's a lot happening in higher education at the moment, and I'd like to make sure there's time for questions. So my next point is there's a lot of interest currently in whether, and I've hinted at this already, the 3-year residential model of higher education is right. So actually 3 years is quite short on an international basis, but the government would like to push people more into 2-year degrees, which I personally think, even though I'm governor, the University of Buckingham, which specialises in 2-year degrees, probably have there are limits to the demand, because most people love university and want to spend as long as possible there. But let's think about the other aspect of that, the residential aspect. We're unusual in the very high proportion of students who move away from home, which has led to some particular challenges in the pandemic, of course. And governments for decades have wanted to change this, shift this, get more students to live at home. And the reason is, of course, it would save them huge sums of money on maintenance costs. But it's nothing new. So you can see from my slide here that in 2018, Damien Hines wanted that. In 2013, John Denham, who was out of office by then, but he was Labour's last higher education minister, wanted that to happen. A survey back in 2011, just as the fees were about to go up, said no one was going to bother moving away from home because they wouldn't be able to afford the rent. And actually, if you go back nearly 50 years to when Margaret Thatcher was Ted Heath's Secretary of State for Education, she wanted far more students to live at home. Her daughter Carol Thatcher did that, and she thought it would be a very good way to save money. By the way, so lots of people want this. I don't think it's going to happen myself. We might have more commuter students, but as a proportion of the total, I don't particularly think it's going to happen. And I don't just say that because HEPI is partly funded by student accommodation providers. I really don't say it for that reason. I say it because the outcomes for commuter students are not always very good, and more likely to drop out, less likely to get a 2-1 or a first, and have some real challenges. And I say it also because I think going away to higher education is seen as part of the transition to adulthood, and moving away from home is seen as a key part of that. And we saw students wanted to do it even in the pandemic. And I also say it because our university sector is much more hierarchical than most countries. So it's the chances are the best course and the best university for you isn't on your doorstep, where in other countries, when universities are more on a par with one another, going to your local university can make more sense. So I've got a couple more, and then I'm going to stop and turn to the questions that have come in. Another big challenge here, and this is not so much what the government says, but what a lot of people say, is COVID changes everything. They say that the new normal, in that cliched phrase, will look completely different to the old normal. Everything will be different. The COVID is changing everything, particularly because of educational technology. And of course, universities have moved very fast, very impressively, to deliver teaching and learning online. And students have been coping with that very well as well. And there's a couple of quotes on the screen there that you can see of forecasts like this. The World Economic Forum says COVID struck our education system like a lightning bolt and shaken it to its core. And the New Statesman also say pretty much everything's going to look different afterwards. I call me naive, call me as having gone native, having worked with universities for so long, call me anything you want, but I don't believe it. And the reason I don't believe it is manifold, actually. But one specific data point from a survey we did last year suggests that if you say to students, what's your what do you find the most useful form of learning? Well, the yellow bars there are the students, the odd other colour, not sure how to describe it, are the applicants. And the most useful form of learning, according to students, is lectures. But all the top three by utility are face-to-face learning, one-to-one, in a lecture, small working groups like seminars. And the less popular, the three least popular options are all the online ones. Now, the pandemic might have changed people's attitude to that, but we drilled down and we did some qualitative work among students on the back of that data as well. And they also told us they like lectures, not always because they're a great learning opportunity, but because it's a great opportunity to see their friends and meet other students. And it's, which is the social aspect. It's partly about what universities like. And we also said to students before the pandemic, if lectures stopped, imagine lectures just stopped, what would you want to take their place? And again, the top answer with over half the respondents was more face-to-face stuff, and digital stuff was a poor second at only about one in three students. So again, the pandemic might have changed that, but again, it's the social aspects that they are missing through some of the online learning, even though some of the online learning can be fantastic. And the other thing we should remember is the EdTech headbangers. And I'm a huge fan of EdTech, by the way. I mean, it can, we're using technology here that it allows this conference to go ahead. I'm a huge fan of it, but it doesn't always impact on people the way the forecasters say it will. And good example of that is Thomas Edison said cinemas would mean lectures, the end of the lecture. Why would anybody bother going and hearing their own lecturer when they could go to the local cinema and have the world's best lecturers beamed in? That was what Thomas Edison thought, but of course it didn't actually turn out like that, just like MOOCs haven't turned out how people expected either. So my final sort of current policy challenge that we're wrestling with, and I realise some of these points are a bit disjointed from one another, but that is the nature of the messy policy making world currently in, is are students regretting going back to university this year? Both the University and College Union and the National Union of Students have implied they are, and I'm sure some students are. I know some members of staff don't feel brilliantly safe teaching the face-to-face options that are still going on. However, I've got to say, I don't think in either case they're speaking for a majority of staff or students. And I say that because of some polling, recent polling that's been done, and we ourselves are going to launch some, this is not our polling, but we are going to launch some of our own next week, which tells a similar story. The first question here was it's polling by Unite students, but done through a proper research company. Are you happy with your decision not to defer because of COVID-19? Well, the overwhelming majority there say yes, they are happy. The sort of yellow and the orange. There's a minority that says they're not happy, and we mustn't pretend there isn't. But most students I meet are in a rush to get on with their lives, and they're pleased they've gone back to university, and they hope that years 2 and 3, if they're freshers, will be like normal, even if year 1 is not. Another question, are you pleased that you moved away from home and you're living in student accommodation? Similar numbers actually are pleased that they did. So we mustn't assume that everything has gone badly this academic year, even though it's been hugely challenging for staff and students. So this is my final slide, which leaves us 9 minutes to delve into any questions that have come in. Just to flag some future HEPI publications. These are all coming out in 2020. We're going to have a third pulse survey on students' views in the pandemic, as I've just referred to. Going to have in early December our first ever, I'm ashamed to say, but it's been worth the wait, I hope, first ever report on climate change in universities. We mustn't forget about the climate change challenge, despite COVID and Brexit predominating our own policy debates. And then I'm going to shine a spotlight on the dropout and non-continuation, because, as I've said in these remarks, it's rising very fast up the government's agenda and is going to be embedded in the ways that universities are assessed in years to come. So I hope that's been a useful canter through some of the big issues facing universities at the moment. I'm going to turn now to the questions, and actually I see most of them are things like, will the slides be made available? Very happy to make them available. And I don't actually see specific questions coming in the policy, so do please type one in. And one is coming in now. I do think a big reason to go to university is to move away from home and the whole experience university gives. So agree, I don't think much will change in how students want their studies delivered. Yeah, that's an interesting comment. Thank you. I mean, of course, there are people, of course, it's mainly a comment agreeing with me, and there are people who profoundly disagree on this. And I was on a webinar yesterday evening with lots of EdTech people who think, for example, artificial intelligence will transform everything, and then maybe the sector's a bit sleepy and naive on that. One of the reasons I don't think that is actually because I'm a parent. I've got children myself. Who are 10 and 8, and I just think when they go to university, I think they'll have an experience that's not entirely dissimilar to the one that I had when they get there. So there, I'm now saying there are some questions in the Q&A, Nick, with a little question mark icon below this one. Here we go. There are some questions. Right, brilliant. How will universities cope with the loss of right, so I'll go from the top. What is your assessment of the risk of universities going bust? I'll go very quickly through these questions because there are 7 here. I think some universities could go bust. I'm sorry to say. No British university has ever gone bust. Some have got close. University College Cardiff in the 1980s got close. Greenwich School of Management, an alternative provider, did go bust a year or so ago, but because it didn't have a university title, barely scraped into the media. The Institute for Fiscal Studies says a dozen could go bust as a result of the pandemic. There is now, of course, a government restructuring regime, so the government will stop them necessarily completely shutting up shop. But I think, I'm sorry to say, that some universities' financial position is no better, clearly, than it was, and some are so I'm afraid that is a risk. How will universities cope with the loss of sorry, it's changing on my screen. Is the lack of the long-awaited papers, such as the response to Augur, a greater concern than the actual rhetoric we are hearing? Well, I suppose my concern about the delay on things like Augur is Theresa May announced the Augur review. Well, she announced a review was going to happen over 3 years ago. There were people starting university when she made that announcement to the Conservative Party conference in 2017. They've now graduated. If we get a response to Augur, even if we get it in January, then there'll be a consultation on any proposals in the back of it, and then there'll probably be a 2-year wait. We're talking about changes to our sector that come in 2022, maybe 2023. If we have a ripping up emissions, that'll probably be 2024. So the problem is, I think, planning horizons. You know, as a board member of 2 universities, I know most universities plan on a sort of 5 to 7 year planning horizon. Most vice chancellors are in post for about 7 years, so it's just very hard to plan, even forgetting Brexit. Pensions are a huge cost. Will the financial position prompt quicker change? The cost of teachers' pensions, local government pensions, and USS keeps going up. Yes, I mean, do have a look at the blog I wrote about this last week. I do think, I'm sorry to say, because you know, I'd love there to be really generous defined benefit pensions available for everybody who works in our sector. But I'm sorry to say, I think the COVID crisis has shone a spotlight. I mean, on lots of things. I mean, for example, you know, investment returns. In the USS now, there are more deferred pensioners, the people who are waiting for their pension to be paid but are no longer working in the sector, and pensioners than there are active members, and there's an enormous £17 billion deficit. So I'm afraid we do need to grip, I think, the pension reform. I know there'll be a huge amount of anger. I know it might lead to industrial action. It's going to be very delicate, very challenging, and of course the challenges to the USS apply to those other pension schemes that you mentioned as well. What is your assessment of the sorry, I've done those. How will universities cope with the loss of funding from events, conferences, catering, summer accommodation, etc.? Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's a shame actually that universities haven't been more open about all their sources of income in the run up to the crisis. We wrote a report a couple of years ago saying universities should be really transparent about where they make their money, including if they make a profit on things like halls of residence, because we need policymakers to understand the basic business model of a British university so that when crises hit, they get it, and also so they understand the cross flows between things, for example, like teaching and research. Lots of politicians would like to cut tuition fees, they'd like to reduce the number of international students in some cases. Well, you can do that, but you're going to hit our research base as well as the diversity of our campuses. Will universities' preferences for face-to-face increase differences between well-resourced providers and those who cannot provide socially distanced, expensive on-campus learning? Yeah, it could do. It could do. But of course, not all students are the same. So for some students, online stuff is brilliant. They can log on when the kids are in bed, for example. So it could do. We already have a sector that is more hierarchical, less united than many university sectors. And lots of policy pressures push for greater diversity, not more collaboration. It's still, we wrote a report just in March, actually, which is on our website, about whether or not we still have a UK higher education sector. The conclusion I wrote, my conclusion was yes, we do. We do. It's stretching at the seams. Devolution, the way universities are funded, the more competitive environment. So it's challenging. Will universities? We get. Do you think we will see the government let a university go bankrupt? Reform paper for those needing help was a little concerning. So this is the government's restructuring paper, which says if a university is in severe financial difficulties, can go into a restructuring regime, and there'll be a restructuring board that will help that university restructure. I think every university will run a mile from being in that restructuring regime. For one thing, I suspect if you enter the restructuring regime, I suspect that's pretty much like handing in your P45 or whatever the equivalent is. For if you're a vice chancellor and your chair of governors might have to go as well. And then my worry is elements of government would want any institution that falls into the restructuring regime to come out looking like what they think, sometimes erroneously, polytechnics were like. They think lots of vocational 2-year degrees. But as I say, we've got to be confident that model will work, and there'll be a lot of pushback from a town or a city that sees its university downgraded. I think the line, as I say, there's an interesting line here. There have been alternative providers, private providers like Greenwich School of Management, that have literally fallen over and left their students bereft. Well, helped their students enroll elsewhere, I should say, which barely scraped the news. But I think it's because it wasn't a university. It was a shame it didn't, because most of their students were black, often from disadvantaged backgrounds in London, and they were delivering a real social need there. But nonetheless, there's a line. I think, in other words, I think there's a big university wouldn't be allowed to fall over. Some small, more specialist institutions might be. Will universities, this is the last question I've got time for because I've only got 20 seconds. Will universities ever go back predominantly to classroom-based teaching? I think the challenge is the demand will be for blended learning. The demand will be for lots of face-to-face stuff and lots of the best techie stuff that's been happening in the crisis. And the demand, people will want both of those things. And that has big cost pressures at a time when resources are falling. I'm now told I am overdue, so I'm going to have to stop there. Please do email me. My email address is on the HEPI website. It's been great fun talking to you. I'm sorry I can't engage more one-to-one with you. I think you will now be returned to the lobby. Thank you so much.